My presentation is entitled Why Stay? Public Union Membership and the Ethics of Precarity. Setup. Janus v. American Federation of State, City, Municipal Employees, a case deeming the imposition of public sector agency fees unconstitutional under the First Amendment, was to be the end of public sector unions. This was according to mass media, and we'll get into that later. If a non-member did not have to pay agency fees, rather, critics argued, droves would opt out and would become the dreaded, quote, free rider. This was not the case. Public sector labor union rates, in fact, have remained relatively steady for the past 2 decades. And so the question is why? Why did these union members stay despite being given a free pass to leave? So the paper and presentation will be structured as follows. I situate Janus in the history of unionism, compelled speech in the court, under the American politics and political development subfield. I will then conduct a content and language analysis of 3 recent union demonstrations alongside post-Janus strategy. This as laid out in a journal article for the American Bar Association, alongside concepts and themes from Judith Butler's chapter Precarious Life. And so moving on to the political development, American politics subfield concerning public sector unionism in the court, there are sort of 4 cases I want to take you through. And we unfortunately don't have time in this presentation to get through all of them, but it's important to know that these sort of the cases at hand really shaped the jurisprudence that Janus would overturn. So these 3 cases started with a case, Railway Employee Department v. Hansen, which basically said the court sort of declined to hear a First Amendment violation in terms of an agency fee that was posed on railway workers because there was no proof at hand that the union was spending those dues for political activity. And moving on to the second case 4 years later in International Association of Machinists, the court was presented with a case in which the union clearly was spending spending mandatory dues for political purposes. And in this specific case, the court they didn't rule on the constitutional merits. The court rather found that the Railway Labor Act, a law underlying the facts of the case, authorized mandatory due agreements to fund the negotiation or administration of collective agreement. And so this prevented the union from using funds for political activity, so the court argued. And so the Supreme Court mapped this affected labor jurisprudence onto the public sector in Abood v. Detroit Board of Education, and this is the ruling that Janus would overturn decades later. And without getting into the facts of the case, really, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, sided with the Board of Education in that service fees withstand constitutional muster so long as the funds are not used for overt political action. And so this model really, one in which the union issues agency fees to non-members in order to avoid a free rider problem, it's the model the court affirmed, and it became the model of unions across the United States. In fact, Abood has acted as a sort of guide for union logistics. And so now we're moving to the case that would overturn it, Janus v. Afshmi. And again, I'm going to just read part of Alito's opinion here. Or rather summarize. So the court in this case, the case I'm focusing on, deemed the imposition of agency fees on non-union members unconstitutional under the First Amendment. We conclude that this arrangement, Alito writes, Samuel Alito, the arrangement of agency fees, the arrangement that underpins the funding models of countless unions, quote, violates the free speech rights of non-members by compelling them to subsidize private speech on matters of substantial public concern. So, minutes after Janus was decided, these grim prophecies surrounding public sector unionism sort of abound. The Times declared it a crushing blow. For the Post, the decision was a big blow. In either case, it appeared public sector unions were approaching their demise. But data displays a more nuanced headline. Rather than delivering a death knell to public collective bargaining units, Janus, for now, presented only a slight interruption. The latest number from the Bureau of Labor Statistics present a sector largely undisturbed. An analysis conducted by the Center for Economic and Policy Research is worth quoting in full. The share and number of union members grew substantially in the public sector in 2020. The former increased by 1.2 percentage points to 34.8%, while the latter grew by over 100,000 workers. These gains are especially remarkable given concerted efforts in recent years to erode public sector collective bargaining. Public sector unionization increased at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. And so I'm using here, in the next section, political theory as a lens, specifically that of Judith Butler and the ethics of precarity. So let me start here. The Greek god Janus, which is what the case... it's not named after the Greek god, but it's fitting, right? He's depicted as having two faces. In the mythological creature, then, it's an appropriate symbolization of the two faces at play in Janus. You have one of the worker himself and that of his fellow worker. And so I make the argument that this multiple-faced deity also sort of directly correlates to Butler's use of the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and his metaphor of the face. And so Butler, writing in Precarious Life, which was an essay published in response to 9/11 and the wars that followed, quotes Levinas in full. I won't here because of the sort of time constraints, but the language of Butler and Levinas, it's a language of dependence, precarity, and collective fates. It's the language and practice of public union members. This is made clear from a study of interviews of public union members by the press at rallies and demonstrations. And so I'm going to go through the last couple of slides here with some sort of speed just for time constraints. So I'm looking at union demonstrations, and I'm looking at sort of the language here. And so the University of Minnesota has a history of turning a blind eye, said one protester, where workers made a public push for higher wages and other demands at the University of Minnesota. And so you see in this the text here, each person, workers of all, and this language is the content. This sort of language and the content of the union members' interviews point toward a solidarity rooted both in the precarity of one's own position as a worker and the precarity of the workers around them. Words of exclusion are sort of few and far between. And so this is sort of happening again, and I'll let you sort of read and pause here for a moment of another sort of example of mentions of injurability and exposure to sort of violence and precarity, in this case at Easter Seals. And so I then move on to sort of public sector unionism and the media and presenting the face to the public, this sort of outcry and response. And so I want to make this clear. While public sector labor unions' media coverage and Supreme Court jurisprudence, they're not akin to the horrors of war. But the same core elements, precarity, representation, and response, are at play. And so I map this Butlerian formula onto the coverage of Janus and the subsequent response. And that sort of may aid in understanding why there was this not this mass exodus of public sector labor members. So if photos of the violence in Vietnam stirred a collective outrage, so too, and again in different ways, did the coverage of right-wing attempts to restructure union power via the court. And there is a correlation I draw between the coverage of the chipping away at public sector unions and the group's response. Dress rehearsals, as two lawyers, labor law lawyers, I should say, write in the American Bar Review, are always useful to prepare an ensemble to go live. They go on to add, in the case of public sector labor, the near miss presented by the Supreme Court's consideration of Friedrich v. California Teachers Association, which was a case that went 4-4 and was never actually heard, but it had the same sort of risk at play in gutting public sector union agency fee arrangements as Janus did. And that was a loud and clear wake-up call that unions needed to be better prepared for the possibility that the court would take a look at mandatory fees in the public sector, just as they did. And we saw this in the coverage, in the language of the coverage. For example, the case, the Times' Adam Liptak wrote, threatened to cripple the ability of public sector unions to collect fees from workers who chose not to join and did not want to pay for collective bargaining activities. He goes on to mention the case set no precedent and left the door open for further challenges once the Supreme Court is back at full strength. And so when Butler, in her text, speaks of the images that furnished a reality during the Vietnam War in particular, she speaks of sort of this unfiltered, often harsh images, one that represent and emphasize just as harsh on-the-ground conditions. And so here in the case of public sector unions, the Times and other legacy media, they employ not a set of harsh images, but a set of sort of fatalistic words that evoked images of bled-dry collective bargaining units. We see cripple the ability, weakening unions. This is the kind of language that was used. And so, wrapping up here, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence surrounding labor, speech, and unionization has been one of deference to union members and aversion toward overt political activity. A conservative shift in the court unraveled one of the core tenets of effective unionization in the public sphere, the agency shop fee. A mass exodus of union members was foretold with certainty in the popular press. And public sector unions responded in kind, recognizing the vulnerability of their position in the workplace in which the state is their employer. Members chose to stay and actively work to stem a possible membership decline. And so taken together, the presented study shows the power of collective action in curbing the adverse impacts of a judicial ruling. This is particularly relevant in light of the court's upcoming decisions regarding abortion, one that, like Janus, is expected to overturn precedent and have sort of these devastating effects. Thank you.